envelope had my name on it, just mine, written in my father's handwriting, and my stepmother was already reaching for it when the attorney pulled it back. "This one," he said quietly, "is not part of the estate proceedings." I watched her hand freeze in midair. I watched my half-brother's jaw tighten. And I stood there in that conference room on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Atlanta, in the gray blazer I'd ironed that morning because I wanted to look like I belonged there, and I thought, "Dad, what did you do? Let me back up." My father was not a war man. He was precise, reserved, the kind of person who showed love through logistics, showing up on time, keeping his promises, paying for things quietly and never mentioning it again. He was a civil engineer who built bridges for 30 years, and I think he believed relationships work the same way, laid a foundation right, and the structure holds itself. He was wrong about that, but I didn't know it until I was 19. My mother died when I was 8. It was sudden, an aneurysm, there one morning and gone by afternoon. And my father spent the next 4 years doing what I now recognize as trying very hard to hold everything together without letting anyone see how destroyed he was. He worked. He made sure I had dinner, clean clothes, someone to drive me to school. He came to my recitals and sat in the third row and clapped at the right moments. He was present in every measurable way. What he wasn't was able to be alone. He married my stepmother. I'll call her Christine. 3 years after my mother passed, I was 11. Christine had a son from her first marriage, my half-brother, who was 13, and from the very first dinner we all had together at an Olive Garden off I-85, I understood something that nobody said out loud. This family had been reorganized, and I was not at the center of the new version. Christine wasn't cruel in any obvious way. She never screamed at me. She never locked me in rooms or withheld food or any of the things that make a story simple. What she did was quieter and, I think, more effective. She redirected my father's attention, his time, his energy. She redirected it constantly toward her son, toward her needs, toward the version of family life she wanted. And my father, who loved me, I truly believe he loved me, went along with it the way a man goes along with a current, slowly, without realizing how far he drifted. By the time I was 17, I was eating dinner mostly in my room, not because anyone told me to, because the table felt like someone else's table. By the time I was 19, I left. I got into the nursing program at Georgia State on a partial scholarship and a lot of federal loans, and I packed 2 duffel bags and a box of books, and I drove away from that house on a Tuesday in August. My father stood on the driveway and watched me go. He didn't ask me to stay. I didn't ask him to ask. That was the last time I lived within 30 miles of him. I want to be honest about what the next 12 years looked like, because I think people hear stories like mine, and they assume it was either all suffering or all triumph, and the truth is, it was mostly just regular life with a hole in it. I finished my nursing degree, then went back for my nurse practitioner certification. I moved to Savannah for a residency, then to a clinic in Charlotte, then back to Atlanta when I found a position I actually wanted. A pediatric urgent care practice that needed someone who could handle chaos without losing her head. I was good at it. I was good at it partly because I'd spent my childhood learning to read rooms, to sense shifts in mood, to make myself useful and small at the same time. I had an apartment I loved, a best friend named Tasha who made me laugh until I couldn't breathe, a cat named Fig who knocked things off counters with great intention. And I had my father, in the background, distant but present. He called me on my birthday every year. He texted me when I sent him photos. We had a rhythm, careful, maintained from a distance, like something that might shatter if handled directly. I knew Christine didn't like the calls. I could hear it in his voice sometimes, a particular kind of careful, the way you speak when someone is listening from the next room. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I'd made my peace. Then he got sick. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3, diagnosed in October. He called me himself to tell me, which surprised me, and his voice on the phone was different, not the careful voice, not the managed voice, but something older and quieter underneath all of it. I wanted you to hear it from me, he said. Okay, I said. There was a pause. I'm sorry, Leah, he said. Just that. Just my name and those two words, and then the conversation moved on to treatment plans and timelines and logistics, the language both of us were most comfortable in. But he said it. He said my name, and he said sorry, and I held on to that for 7 months while he died. I flew home for the last 2 weeks. Christine was not pleased. She didn't say so directly. She never did anything directly, but I could feel it in the way she arranged herself in the hospital room, always between us, always with some task that required my father's attention exactly when I arrived. My half-brother, whose name I will not give the satisfaction of including here, was worse. He'd grown into a man who wore his entitlement like a cologne, and he made clear, through a series of pointed non-comments, that my presence was a disruption to a grief that he considered his. My father died on a Thursday morning in March, at 6:42 a.m., with the light coming grey through the hospital blinds. I was in the waiting room. Christine had arranged for family only in the final hour, and when I said I was family, she looked at me with an expression so carefully neutral that it communicated everything. I sat in a plastic chair and drank vending machine coffee and waited, and when the doctor came to find us, he found me there too, and he told us together. The funeral was in 5 days. I booked a hotel room. I was not going to stay in that house. The service was at a church in Marietta, one my father had attended for 20 years. There were a lot of people there. He had been well liked, colleagues, neighbors, men he'd played golf with on Saturday mornings, people from the church itself. The parking lot was full. I arrived in the grey blazer. I sat 3 rows back on the left side. My half-brother gave a eulogy that centered almost entirely on himself. Christine wore black and received condolences with the particular grace of a woman who had rehearsed. I sat in my row and thought about the bridge my father had built in 1997, the one I used to ask him about when I was little, the one he said was the project he was most proud of. I thought about how he used to draw the blueprints out on paper for me, explaining the load-bearing principles, the distribution of weight. I thought about how careful he was with structure. I thought about how much I was my father's daughter in ways neither of us ever said out loud. The reading of the will was 3 days later. Christine's attorney had arranged it. I was notified somewhat reluctantly that I was included as a named party and therefore needed to be present. The conference room was on the 14th floor, and it had a long table and a view of downtown and a pitcher of water that nobody touched. Christine sat at one end with her attorney. My half-brother sat next to her. Their combined body language made the room feel like a meeting I had interrupted. Their attorney read through the estate documents, the house, the accounts, the pension disbursements, a property in North Carolina I hadn't known about. Item by item, systematically, all of it flowing in a direction I had already understood before I arrived. I was not surprised. I had spent 12 years preparing myself not to be surprised. What I had not prepared for was the other attorney. Midway through the reading, the conference room door opened and a man stepped in who was not part of Christine's arrangement. He was older, grey-haired, carrying a briefcase, and he introduced himself as my father's personal attorney. Not the estate attorney, not the firm Christine had retained, but the man my father had apparently hired quietly, on his own, 8 months before he died. Christine's attorney frowned. "This is a private proceeding." "I'm aware," the man said. He set his briefcase on the table. "I have one item to introduce executed independently which I'm required to deliver in the presence of all named parties." He looked at me. "Ms. Leah Harmon?" I said yes. He set the envelope on the table in front of me. That was when Christine reached for it, and that was when he pulled it back. My father had written me a letter. 5 pages, in his handwriting, the same precise printing he'd used on blueprints, on birthday cards, on the grocery lists I used to read off the refrigerator as a kid. I did not read it in that room, I couldn't. I folded it back into the envelope, and I sat with it in my lap, and I looked at the table, and I breathed. What the attorney read aloud, the part he was required by the document to read in the presence of all parties, was a single addendum, a financial account separate from the estate, an account my father had opened in my name 11 years ago, an account he had contributed to, quietly, annually, without telling me or Christine or anyone. The number he read made the room go still. It wasn't a fortune. I want to be accurate about this, because I'm not telling a fantasy. It was $432,000. 11 years of contributions quietly compounding, a civil engineer's way of building a load-bearing structure in secret, brick by brick, because he knew the foundation of the thing he'd built at home was not going to hold my weight. Christine's face did not collapse. She was too controlled for that, but something in it shifted, some arrangement of composure that had taken years to construct, and I watched it move. My half-brother said, "That's not possible." The attorney said, "The account was established independently of the estate, which means it is not subject to the estate proceedings. It transfers directly." He never. My half-brother looked at Christine. "Did you know about this?" Christine said nothing. And in her silence I understood something I had been circling for 20 years. She had known my father had guilt. She had managed it. What she hadn't known was the form it took. I read the letter that night, alone in my hotel room, with Fig's carrier in the corner. I had driven up, I couldn't leave him, and room service I didn't eat going cold on the table. My father was not a man who talked about feelings. The letters showed that. He used the language of accounting and engineering even when he was trying to say something human. He talked about deficits and structural failures and things that needed to be corrected before the load shifted permanently. But underneath the language, page by page, was something I recognized. He knew. He knew what had happened in that house. He knew what Christine had done. Not through cruelty, but through the slow, patient redirecting of his attention until I was on the periphery of my own family. He knew he had let it happen. He called it the worst failure of his professional and personal life, in that order, because that was how he thought. He said he had started the account because he couldn't fix what had been broken, but he could make sure I had something that was structurally mine, that no one could redirect away from me. He said, "I know you built your life without me. I just wanted to make sure I was part of the foundation in some way, even if you couldn't see it." I sat with that for a long time. I thought about the bridge he built in 1997. I thought about how he said the most important part of a bridge is the part underneath. The part no one sees, the part in the water, the pilings driven down into the riverbed, where there's no visibility and no applause. Just the slow, certain work of holding something up. I thought about how I had held myself up for 12 years thinking I was doing it alone. I called Tasha that night, and she listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her, and when I finished there was a pause and she said, "What do you want to do with it?" "I don't know yet," I said. "Do you want to confront her?" I thought about Christine's face in that conference room, the arrangement of composure moving. "No," I said, and I meant it. The thing I had wanted for 20 years was not to win against Christine. It was to be seen, to have my father see me, acknowledge me, choose me in some form even once. He had done that 11 years ago, in secret, in the only language he was fluent in. That was enough. Not everything I wanted, not everything I needed, but enough. What happened next with Christine and my half-brother, I know only in pieces, through a cousin who stayed in touch and told me things I sometimes wish she hadn't. The estate had been structured in ways that made sense when the hidden account wasn't a factor. With the account removed from the calculation, some of the numbers that Christine's arrangements had depended on didn't work as cleanly. There were conversations with attorneys, There were, apparently, questions about certain financial decisions made during my father's illness. Decisions that someone who was looking would find worth examining. I was not the one looking. I want to be clear about that. I had an attorney of my own by then, a woman I'd found through a colleague, and her job was to receive what my father had left me, not to pursue anyone. But my father had kept records. He was an engineer. He kept records the way other people kept grudges. Meticulously, without apparent emotion, because that was simply the correct way to do things. Those records, I was told, were attached to the letter in a separate sealed document that the attorney was required to deliver to the appropriate parties if certain conditions were met. I don't know exactly what was in them. I know that 2 months after the will reading, Christine sold the house in Marietta and moved out of state. I know my half-brother stopped posting on social media sometime around the same period. I know that my father's personal attorney sent me a brief note saying that everything had been resolved and that my father had been, in his words, very thorough. My father, the man who built bridges, who believed the most important work was the work beneath the surface. I went back to Atlanta. I went back to my clinic, my patients, my apartment, knocking things off the counter. Tasha came over the weekend after I got home, and we sat on my kitchen floor eating takeout pad thai, and she asked how I was actually doing, and I tried to answer honestly. I miss him, I said. I missed him for a long time before he even died. That's the part I'm still figuring out how to grieve. She nodded. I think he loved me, I said. I think he loved me, and he wasn't strong enough to show it the way I needed. And he knew it. And the account was his way of saying so. And I think I have to decide if that's enough to make peace with. Tasha was quiet for a moment. Is it? She said. I looked at the envelope, which I had set on my kitchen counter when I got home and hadn't moved. I think it's a start, I said. There are things I know now that I didn't know when I was the girl eating dinner in her room. I know that grief is not a single loss but a series of them, each one nested inside the last. I know that some fathers love their children in ways the children cannot access until much later, sometimes too late, sometimes in an envelope on a conference room table. I know that being pushed to the edges of something doesn't mean you don't belong to it. I know that my father built things that lasted, and whatever else he failed at, he built something for me that lasted, quietly, in secret, while I was out building myself. I still have the letter. It's in a drawer in my bedroom, in the same envelope it came in. I don't read it often, but sometimes when things are hard, when I'm tired in the way that goes deeper than sleep, I take it out and I hold it, and I think about the pilings in the riverbed. The work no one sees, the part that holds everything up. It's enough to keep going. I keep thinking about the account my father opened 11 years before I knew it existed. Not the money, the decision. The quiet, private act of a man who knew he had failed someone he loved and who chose, without fanfare, without asking for credit, to do something about it anyway. He didn't tell me. He didn't use it to bargain for closeness or to excuse what he'd allowed to happen. He just built the thing, year after year, the way he built everything, carefully, with his eyes on the long term, trusting that structure outlasts the people who made it. I've thought a lot about what it takes to do something like that. To act rightly when no one is watching and no one will know. To hold yourself accountable to a standard you set in private, because your own sense of what's fair demands it. My father wasn't a man who talked about integrity. He just practiced it, in silence, in the one language he had. That's the part that stays with me. Because the easier thing, the human thing, would have been to let it go. To tell himself he'd done his best, that I'd turned out fine, that the distance between us was mutual. He could have believed that. A lot of people believe easier versions of the truth about themselves, but he didn't. He looked at what he'd done and what he hadn't done, and he made a different choice, not a loud one, not one that required my forgiveness or my acknowledgement, just a choice held quietly for 11 years. I think about the intelligence that takes not book intelligence but the harder kind, The kind that requires you to look at a situation clearly without the distortions of ego or self-protection and understand what it actually is. My father saw what Christine had done. He saw what he had allowed. He didn't dress it up. He called it in his letter a structural failure, his words, his frame, and then he figured out what could still be corrected and he corrected it. And I think about what it took for me to receive that. To sit in that conference room without collapsing into bitterness. To drive home with the envelope and read it alone and not let the grief of what I'd missed harden into something that would cost me the rest of my life. That took something too. 12 years of building myself when I thought I was doing it alone. 12 years of choosing every morning to keep going, not for anyone watching, not for any reward, just because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was never something I was willing to do. The three of us, my father, Tasha, who stayed, and me, we all made choices in this story. Some of those choices cost things that can't be returned. Some of them built things that lasted. What I know now is that the choices we make when no one is watching are the ones that define us most completely. My father's best act was invisible for 11 years. My survival happened in rooms where no one applauded. The things worth building usually look like nothing from the outside for a very long time. I still have the letter in my drawer. I still think about the pilings in the riverbed. It's enough.